The Imperial Japanese Navy believed they were untouchable. Their convoys were massive, heavily armed, and shielded by layers of destroyers. For years, they moved across the Pacific with the confidence of a force no submarine could challenge. But one morning, deep in the black waters of the South China Sea, a single American submarine would destroy that illusion in a matter of hours. This is the story the Japanese Admiralty refused to believe at first, a report so shocking, so humiliating, that senior commanders thought it was a mistake. They insisted no American submarine could sink 5 warships in one engagement. Impossible. But it wasn't impossible. It happened, and it was done by one submarine and one commander whose audacity rewrote naval warfare. The USS Albacore, a silent predator lurking beneath the waves, was never supposed to take on an entire convoy alone. But on that day, in the most daring and ruthless attack of its career, the Albacore pierced the Japanese shield, tore through destroyer screens, slipped under sonar nets, and fired torpedoes with surgical precision. Within minutes, chaos erupted. Destroyers exploded. Escorts burned. Ships broke apart and vanished into the sea. Japanese sailors described the attack as lightning from a black ocean. Officers would later write that the submarine moved like a ghost, appearing where no hunter should be, striking faster than the destroyers could react, then vanishing into the depths. By the time the waters calmed, 5 ships were gone. 5. The Japanese Navy had never witnessed anything like it, and it would mark one of the most devastating single-engagement submarine victories in World War II history. This is not just a battle story. This is a shockwave that shook Japan to its core. They used to say a submarine was a coffin with an engine, a steel tube packed with nerves, sweat, rust, and fear, sneaking through waters ruled by battleships, cruisers, destroyers, planes, mines, and patrols that wanted it dead every second of every hour. Inside that coffin, one mistake meant pressure ripping the hull apart like paper. One wrong decision meant drowning in the dark, lungs filling as the ocean crushed the ship flat. And yet, somehow, a single American submarine would become the most terrifying predator the Imperial Japanese Navy had ever seen. A hunter so precise, so relentless, that sailors whispered its name with a kind of dread usually reserved for storms and ghosts. They called it the Destroyer Killer. But no one, not even the U.S. Navy, expected what it would do next. 5 ships, 5 kills, one mission nobody believed was possible. It began long before the Japanese ever spotted it. Long before radar pings, depth charges, or the echo of footsteps running across a destroyer deck as alarms screamed, Taijiki. Submarine. The story began deep in the Pacific, where quiet blue water stretched for miles and warships prowled with their guns ready to tear anything alive into pieces. There, a single submarine drifted just beneath the surface, hidden like a shadow that had learned to breathe. USS Harder, a boat so feared by the Japanese that they assigned entire anti-submarine divisions whose only job was to make sure it never surfaced again. Harder had a reputation. Every time it appeared, somebody died. It didn't matter whether it was a destroyer, a transport, or an escort vessel. Harder found them, stalked them, and eliminated them with an almost surgical brutality. Her captain, Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton, had trained his men one way: shoot first, risk everything, and never give the enemy time to react. But this time, the war was shifting. Battleships were moving south. Convoys were choosing new routes. Japanese destroyers were roaming aggressively, hunting instead of escorting. The Empire knew their supply lines were bleeding. They knew American submarines were slicing their lifelines like piano wire. So they adapted, sending faster, more experienced, more ruthless destroyer crews into contested waters. These ships were not escorts. They were predators designed to chase down submarines and rip them apart with depth charges and naval cannons. Most submarines avoided these hunters. Harder did the opposite. Harder went toward them. The crew didn't know it yet, but the next few days would push them into the most dangerous chess match in the entire Pacific. They were about to face swarming destroyers, coordinated attack patterns, sonar web traps, and captains who knew exactly how to kill a submarine. But what nobody understood, not even the Americans, was that Harder was evolving faster than the enemy could adapt. It was getting smarter, deadlier, hungrier. and what it was about to do would shake the Imperial Japanese Navy to its core. Before dawn, the ocean looked peaceful. Too peaceful. That was always a bad sign. War rarely gave quiet moments without charging double for them later. The sky above the water glowed faintly orange, the kind of soft light sailors dread because it reveals silhouettes miles away. On the submarine's bridge, binoculars scanned the horizon in slow, controlled sweeps. Every man on watch felt the same knot in his stomach, the instinct that something was out there. Something big. Inside the sub, the atmosphere was tense. Diesel fumes mixed with sweat. Men whispered instead of speaking. Somewhere forward, torpedo-men checked firing pins for the 10th time. In the control room, the sonar operator leaned close to his headphones, waiting for the first faint echo, the warning that their enemy had arrived. Minutes passed. Nothing. Then, the ocean spoke. A faint pulse. A distant rumble. A signature so heavy that even before the operator decoded it, the captain already knew. That was no merchant ship. The sonar man lifted his head, eyes wide. Multiple screws, fast, closing. A pause. Sir, that's a destroyer group. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Destroyers were submarine killers. They carried depth charges capable of crushing a hull in seconds. Their sonar nets covered huge distances. Their captains were trained to think like wolves, smell weakness, surround, corner, and annihilate. But Harder didn't dive deeper. Harder turned toward them. Some say that moment was madness. Some say it was genius. Competitor channels tell it like a myth. This is where the hunter hunted back. But if you were there, if you were one of the men standing on Harder's deck, watching the dawn reveal thin silhouettes on the horizon, you would not have felt heroic. You would have felt small. Very small. 6 destroyers, cutting across the water in a V formation. Their funnels belching smoke. Their wakes slicing the sea like knives. They looked unstoppable, untouchable, like iron beasts marching toward their prey. But Harder saw something else. The destroyers were overconfident, moving too fast, spreading out too wide, relying too heavily on their sonar sweeps. They weren't expecting an attack, because no submarine captain would ever be suicidal enough to charge 6 destroyers head-on. Except one. Battle stations. Everything inside the submarine shifted at once. Men sprinted into position. Torpedoes slid into firing tubes with metallic finality. Depth gauges trembled as the boat descended into the dark. The atmosphere changed. No more whispers, no more nerves. Only focus. Harder angled into the approach. The destroyers altered course, engines roaring. They had picked up something, maybe a faint radar reflection, maybe a sonar anomaly. Whatever it was, they reacted immediately, tightening formation, accelerating, ready to strike. The destroyer captain who spotted Harder probably thought he had won the lottery. Submarine on the surface. Early morning visibility. Perfect angle of attack. He ordered full speed. Guns prepared to fire. He didn't know he had just entered the kill zone. Inside Harder, the torpedo data computer hummed softly. Angles. Speed. Distance. Firing solution. Open outer doors. The first destroyer bore down, bow cutting through water like a blade. Within seconds, it would be in firing range. Stand by. A heartbeat. Another. Fire one. The torpedo leapt from the tube. Then another. And another. 3 in total, racing through the water at 46 knots, invisible beneath the waves. The destroyer saw the wakes too late. Explosions ripped through its hull, fire bursting from the bow, the ship lifting violently as metal shattered and compartments collapsed. Sailors were thrown across the deck, alarms blaring, steam venting in chaotic bursts. The destroyer tried to turn, but the internal flooding dragged it sideways. A second explosion snapped its keel. Water surged in. The destroyer, designed to kill submarines, was sinking in under 2 minutes. The entire Japanese formation froze. Not physically, they were still moving, but mentally. Shock. Confusion. They couldn't believe what they just saw. One submarine had just ambushed a destroyer in open water. That wasn't supposed to happen. It never happened. Harder didn't wait to be admired. Dive. Hard left rudder. Take her down fast. The submarine plunged as depth charge launchers aboard the remaining destroyers swung into position. The water shook violently as the enemy retaliated. Depth charges detonated in rapid succession, smashing pressure waves into Harder's hull. Lights flickered. Pipes rattled. Men grabbed whatever they could to brace themselves. But the submarine held. The Japanese destroyers regrouped, furious and humiliated. They weren't retreating. They were going to avenge their sister ship, and they had 5 vessels left to do it. Inside harder, the captain watched the depth gauge stabilize. He knew what was coming. Hours of pursuit. Hundreds of depth charges. A cat-and-mouse nightmare. Any other submarine would have used the sinking as a distraction to escape. Harder chose differently. It went back for round 2. And this was only the beginning. The Pacific was endless, a mirror of steel and sky, stretching beyond the horizon where the Japanese fleet had once ruled with confidence. It was October 1944, and the men aboard the USS Samuel B. Roberts were no strangers to tension. They had trained for months, drilled for hours, every maneuver rehearsed until instinct replaced thought. But nothing in their experience could prepare them for what awaited at Leyte Gulf. The morning fog clung to the water like a living thing, and the first whisper of enemy engines sounded like a drumbeat of doom. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, barely older than some of his crew, leaned over the bridge railing. His eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the waves, each ripple a potential threat, each shadow a possible destroyer of life. The destroyer escort was small, a single steel arrow against a sea full of giants. Battleships and cruisers loomed somewhere beyond the mist, their firepower unimaginable, their decks crawling with men trained for destruction. For anyone else, the very idea of standing against them was madness. Yet here they were, engines humming, hearts pounding, waiting for the order that could decide not just their lives but the course of a battle that stretched across islands and oceans. Every sailor knew the stakes. Every man understood that their ship was not meant for this fight. It was a guardian, a protector of convoys, a shadow in the vastness. And yet, the Samuel B. Roberts was about to become a spear, thrown into the heart of an enemy force that thought itself invincible. Around the deck, men adjusted their positions, fingers trembling over triggers, eyes locked on radar blips, each one a potential harbinger of destruction. The radio crackled with static, messages slicing through the tension like knives. Commands, warnings, updates, all fragments of a larger plan that felt impossibly fragile. And then the first sighting, smoke on the horizon, massive silhouettes emerging from the fog. The pride of the Imperial Navy advancing with the calm confidence of a predator that has never known fear. The destroyer shuddered under the strain of anticipation. Every heartbeat aboard was a countdown, a silent drum marking the approach of death. Copeland gripped the railing tighter. He had trained for this moment, but training could not account for the reality, the raw, consuming scale of the threat. Around him, sailors whispered prayers, muttered reassurances, dared to hope that courage could stand against steel and fire. The enemy fleet was vast, 11 battleships cutting through the water like knives, accompanied by cruisers, destroyers, and countless support ships. Every vessel bristled with guns capable of reducing the Roberts to splinters in minutes. Yet as the morning sun pierced the fog, casting a pale gold light across the waves, a strange kind of clarity settled over Copeland and his crew. They were small. They were outgunned. They were alone. And yet they had a mission, a single, almost impossible objective: to slow the advance, to protect the landing forces at Leyte, to buy minutes, hours, even days of survival for countless others who could not fight. Torpedoes were loaded. Depth charges primed. Every man knew that once the first shots rang out, there would be no retreat. The destroyer escort would have to dance with death, weaving through fire and smoke, relying on agility, wit, and the sheer will to survive. As the Japanese ships drew closer, the sea itself seemed to tremble, waves rising like a warning, the spray stinging faces, mixing with sweat and fear. Copeland barked orders, sharp and precise, his voice cutting through the tension. Men obeyed instantly, their bodies moving as one, trained mechanisms in the service of a human will. Somewhere in the distance, a lookout shouted, "Enemy bearing 080." The words were simple, yet carried the weight of imminent annihilation. Guns roared in response, the Roberts firing not to destroy but to distract, to confuse, to survive. Moments stretched, each one an eternity. Explosions painted the sea with fire, smoke curling in dark plumes. Japanese shells slammed into the water around them, waves of force that shook the hull and rattled teeth. The destroyer twisted, pivoted, a small target in a massive theater of war. Every maneuver was calculated, every decision a brush with death. Men prayed silently, some to God, others to luck, none truly believing either would save them. And yet, against all reason, they pressed forward, guided by training, courage, and a strange defiance that rose from the knowledge that surrender here meant obliteration. The first torpedo was launched, cutting through the water with deadly precision. Moments later, the shockwave hit the first enemy cruiser, a massive steel wall shuddering under unseen violence. Explosions erupted, fire spilling across the deck, men scrambling, chaos consuming order. The Samuel B. Roberts danced on the edge of annihilation, dodging shells, returning fire, each movement a gamble that could end lives in seconds. Copeland's mind raced, calculating angles, speeds, distances, probabilities. In this moment, doctrine, training, and instinct fused into a singular force, pushing a small ship beyond its perceived limits. Around him, men shouted, fired, ducked, and prayed. The ocean itself became a battlefield of light, fire, and steel, each moment a question. Who would survive? Who would fall? And who would live to tell the tale that would shock Japan to its core? The morning haze began to lift, revealing the full scope of the Japanese formation. Battleships, heavy cruisers, and destroyers stretched across the horizon, their sheer mass a monument to industrial might and military pride. Copeland stood rigid on the bridge, binoculars pressed to his eyes, calculating every movement. Each ship was a world unto itself, bristling with guns, men, and explosives capable of flattening the Samuel B. Roberts in moments. Around him, the crew moved with synchronized precision, a ballet of urgency, skill, and barely contained fear. Every sound, the hum of engines, the clanging of metal, the distant thump of artillery, etched itself into their minds, a rhythm that could either guide or betray them. The first target had been identified, a Japanese destroyer on the flank, its armor thinner than the heavy cruisers ahead, but fast, agile, dangerous. Torpedoes were armed, depth charges ready. Copeland knew the odds. They were negligible, and yet, hesitation was not an option. He barked orders, voice cutting through the controlled chaos. Prepare to launch. Bearings ready. Fire when prepared. Below deck, sailors gripped torpedo controls, their knuckles white, muscles trembling with tension. Each second dragged, stretched, folded upon itself, yet compressed in the mind. The sea around them was deceptively calm, hiding the invisible menace just beneath the surface. They had been trained for this, drilled for months. Yet the reality of standing against a fleet of giants was different. Fear became a tangible weight, pressing against ribs, stealing breath. And yet, amid the fear, a strange clarity emerged, a singular purpose that transcended doubt. Copeland's finger hovered over the firing mechanism. Around him, the crew followed instinct, each man aware that survival depended on timing, coordination, and luck. And then, the signal. The torpedo slipped into the water with barely a whisper. Seconds later, the explosion erupted, tearing through the destroyer's hull. Water, steel, and fire erupted skyward, a plume of destruction that was almost too beautiful to comprehend. Men on the Samuel B. Roberts watched, some in awe, some in disbelief. The enemy ship shuddered, then listed, and finally sank beneath the waves, leaving nothing but smoke and splintered steel. The Japanese fleet reacted instantly. Guns roared, shells screamed through the air, splashing around the Samuel B. Roberts, each one a question of life or death. Copeland twisted the helm, evading strikes by inches, relying on a combination of speed, intuition, and sheer luck. The small ship was a dart in a hailstorm of fire, maneuvering through chaos with the agility of a predator. Below, sailors fired anti-aircraft guns, depth charges, and torpedoes, each action a precise dance of survival. Explosions rocked the hull, splintering deck plates, sending shards of metal across the decks. Men fell, rose, moved, and prayed. The boundary between fear and adrenaline blurred until it ceased to exist. The second kill was almost instantaneous. Another torpedo launched, another enemy ship crippled. Fire spread across the Japanese cruiser, thick smoke curling into the sky, staining the horizon with orange and black. Copeland's eyes were locked on the bridge, calculating every angle, anticipating every reaction. Around him, the crew moved as one, a unit of steel and nerves, each man's life tied inseparably to the other's. Survival was no longer a question. It was a coordinated effort, a rhythm dictated by training, courage, and a stubborn refusal to yield. Somewhere beyond the fog, more ships advanced, their massive guns preparing to turn the Samuel B. Roberts into a graveyard. But the small destroyer escort had found its rhythm. Each movement was precise, each shot calculated, each maneuver a gamble that pushed the ship to its limits. The sea itself seemed to acknowledge the struggle, waves rising and falling with uncanny timing, as if urging the small vessel forward. Copeland's mind was a blur of calculations: distance, speed, angles, shell trajectories. He didn't think about the odds, he acted. Every decision carried the weight of life and death. Around him, sailors whispered, shouted, fired, and prayed, a symphony of chaos and focus. They had become a single entity, a unit forged in fear and determination, standing alone against overwhelming force. And yet, amid the terror, a strange clarity persisted. They were making a difference. They were slowing the enemy. They were surviving. And in that survival, a seed of disbelief took root within the Japanese fleet. For every ship they sank, for every torpedo launched, the Samuel B. Roberts grew in legend, becoming more than steel. It became defiance incarnate, a ghost in the mist, a destroyer killer. The morning mist thickened into a shroud, clinging to the waves like smoke from distant fires. Copeland stood on the bridge, eyes straining against the haze, searching for movement that could mean life or death. The Samuel B. Roberts, a small destroyer escort barely able to rival the massive cruisers and battleships arrayed before them, had already claimed 2 kills. But the enemy was far from finished. Guns larger than their own ship roared in the distance, sending curtains of water into the air. Each shell was a question, each explosion a reminder of how fragile the small American vessel truly was. Below decks, the crew had fallen into a rhythm born of desperation. Torpedoes were readied, depth charges set, anti-aircraft guns manned. The fear that had once threatened to paralyze them now became precision. Men moved with deliberate urgency, each aware that hesitation would mean annihilation. Orders were shouted, repeated, executed without question. In that chaos, a strange calm emerged, a clarity that only comes when life is reduced to the simple equation of action and consequence. The Japanese fleet shifted, attempting to flank the Samuel B. Roberts, to crush it under the weight of numbers and firepower. Copeland anticipated every move, guiding his small ship through impossible angles, skimming the surface with the grace of a predator. Every evasive maneuver carried the risk of collision, grounding, or worse, a direct hit from shells designed to obliterate them. But each gamble was measured, precise, executed with the intuition of men who had faced death and decided to dance with it instead. Then came the moment that would define the battle. A massive cruiser, its armor glinting in the sunlight, advanced directly toward them. Copeland's hand hovered over the firing mechanism. Below, sailors gripped the torpedoes as if holding their own lives in their hands. Seconds stretched, slowed, became an eternity. The torpedo was launched, slipping into the water silently, a ghost seeking steel. The explosion erupted with a thunderous roar. Fire ripped through the cruiser's deck, sending smoke spiraling into the sky, staining the horizon orange and black. The enemy ship shuddered violently before succumbing to the sea. The crew of the Samuel B. Roberts cheered, not with triumph but with disbelief. They had done the impossible. 2 kills had become 3, and with each sinking ship, the legend of the small destroyer grew, a phantom haunting the pride of the Japanese fleet. But there was no time to celebrate. Enemy fire intensified. Shells screamed past, some striking the water dangerously close, others tearing through the rails and hull. Men were thrown to the deck, splinters cutting skin, adrenaline fueling every movement. Copeland's eyes darted to each threat, calculating speed, distance, trajectory. Below, the crew responded in perfect unison, firing torpedoes, maneuvering depth charges, dodging, weaving, surviving. For the Japanese commanders, disbelief began to fester. How could a single escort, so small and lightly armed, evade destruction while inflicting such damage? Rumors would later claim that the Samuel B. Roberts was more than steel. It was a symbol, a ghost, an impossible adversary that made men question the certainty of victory. And for Copeland and his crew, the day was far from over. They had survived the initial onslaught, crippled a cruiser, and made the enemy fleet hesitate. But deeper challenges awaited. The heart of the Japanese formation loomed ahead, massive, unyielding, determined to crush every ounce of defiance. The small ship had become a lightning rod, drawing the full fury of a navy trained to dominate. Every decision, every movement, carried the weight of life and death, not just for themselves, but for the legacy of what courage against impossible odds could achieve. Amid the chaos, a quiet understanding passed through the crew. They were no longer just sailors. They were a unit of history, living proof that skill, courage, and unrelenting will could tilt the scales of war, if only for moments that would echo across decades. The sea around them was a battlefield of smoke, fire, and shattered steel, yet in that storm, the Samuel B. Roberts moved like a shadow, a destroyer killer in the truest sense, unstoppable not by size, but by daring. Smoke and fire clung to the horizon like a living wall. The Samuel B. Roberts had already shocked the Japanese fleet, but Copeland knew the danger was far from over. Every decision now was magnified 1,000-fold. The destroyer escort was no longer a shadow in the mist. It was the target of every eye, every gun, every torpedo on those massive enemy ships. The moment the fleet realized that a single small ship had defied them, their response was swift, calculated, and merciless. Copeland tightened his grip on the wheel, feeling the vibrations through the deck. The ship was battered, scars of battle etched into every plank, every railing. Below, sailors moved with grim determination, torpedoes armed, depth charges primed, eyes sharp. They knew the statistics. How many destroyers had survived confrontations with battleships? Almost none. But this was no ordinary crew, no ordinary ship. Every man had felt the hand of death brush past and survived, a fragile, terrifying grace that now powered their focus. The Japanese began to coordinate their attack. Cruisers moved into position, their massive guns tearing through the waves with precision. Aircraft overhead circled, dive-bombing with intent to obliterate the Samuel B. Roberts before it could maneuver. Copeland's voice rang out over the chaos, clear, controlled. Prepare to launch at will. Evasive maneuvers, all stations, steady. A torpedo streaked across the water, barely missed, and struck a destroyer escort in the convoy behind them. The explosion sent a shockwave that rattled the Roberts' hull, throwing men off balance. Splinters flew. The screams of the injured echoed below deck. There was no time to mourn, no time to question the odds. Survival demanded motion, precision, and instinct. Depth charges were deployed, the explosions sending pillars of water into the sky. Copeland calculated each move, guiding the Roberts through a deadly dance, turning the enemy's confidence into hesitation. Every ship that aimed, every gun that fired, became a question mark. Could a destroyer escort truly escape? Could it truly strike back? Then came the second kill. A Japanese cruiser, confident and heavily armored, was maneuvering to encircle the small American ship. Copeland anticipated, torpedoes armed and ready. They hit the mark. The explosion ripped through steel, flames consumed the deck, and the sea claimed another of Japan's finest. The Roberts had done it again. The crew cheered, but it was a muted, tense celebration. Each victory invited a storm. Each kill painted a target bigger than before. The battle raged onward. Waves of smoke and fire, twisting metal, and the cries of men, American and Japanese alike, filled the horizon. Copeland's strategy became almost instinctual. Feint, strike, evade, repeat. The Samuel B. Roberts, small and fragile, moved like a phantom among giants, leaving destruction in its wake. Every second stretched. Every maneuver mattered. The enemy's disbelief turned into anger, into fury, into reckless aggression. They had underestimated a destroyer escort before. They would not do it again. But for Copeland and his crew, the day had already become legend, a testament to courage that no cannon, no battleship, no fleet could erase. And yet, as the sun dipped low, turning the sea to molten gold, a quiet dread settled over the crew. The worst was not the ships behind them. It was the heart of the Japanese fleet, waiting, massive, ready to crush anything foolish enough to challenge it. The Samuel B. Roberts had proven it could strike, evade, and survive, but could it continue against a force designed to annihilate every ship in its path? The answer lay in the moments to come, in decisions made in a heartbeat, in the relentless courage of men who refused to surrender, even when everything around them demanded it. The horizon had become a theater of fire and steel. The Samuel B. Roberts, battered but unbowed, pressed forward into waters where every wave hid a potential death. Smoke from distant cruisers mingled with the morning mist, creating a surreal gray haze. Each man on deck could feel the heat of enemy guns through the soles of his boots, through the vibrations of the deck, through the very air that seemed to tremble with threat. Copeland's eyes scanned the sea with a sharp intensity, catching the subtle ripple of water that betrayed the movement of a Japanese destroyer, or the glint of sun on armor plates that should have crushed them long ago. All stations, torpedoes ready, he ordered. There was no hesitation, no room for doubt. Every decision was a potential death sentence. The men obeyed without question, their training and fear fused into instinct. A shell exploded nearby, hurling seawater and debris across the deck. Sailors scrambled, clutching ropes, bracing themselves, shouting over the roar of battle. Yet the Roberts pressed on. They had already sunk one cruiser, damaged another. The enemy had learned not to dismiss them, but learning was slow when fear had already taken root. Copeland calculated angles, trajectories, distances, all in seconds. Each calculation meant life or death, success or obliteration. The second Japanese cruiser, larger, faster, more menacing, began to circle. Its guns trained on the Roberts with deadly precision. Copeland's hands tightened on the wheel. He had one opportunity, a calculated strike that could either sink the cruiser or doom his ship. "Fire!" he shouted. Torpedoes streaked across the water, cutting through the waves with lethal purpose. The explosions rocked the enemy vessel, sending flames and smoke into the sky. Another kill. The crew cheered, but it was a tense, careful cheer. They knew the victory had only drawn more attention, more fury. The Roberts dodged and weaved, turning its fragility into an advantage. Enemy shells overshot, skidded across the waves, or exploded harmlessly in the distance. Every evasion was precise, almost surgical. Copeland's mind moved faster than thought, anticipating, reacting, surviving. The men below decks worked furiously to reload, to repair damage, to keep the small ship alive against impossible odds. Time seemed to stretch, the battle folding in on itself. Each strike the Roberts landed was a whisper of defiance, a statement that courage could bend the rules of war. Yet, for every ship they sank, another seemed to appear, rising like a phantom from the haze, a towering testament to the might of the Japanese fleet. As the sun climbed, turning the sea to liquid steel, Copeland realized that survival depended not on strength, but on precision, on audacity, on the ability to make a small ship move like a ghost among giants. The Samuel B. Roberts had already become legend to the enemy, a symbol of defiance, but legends could be destroyed. One wrong move, one miscalculation, and the destroyer escort would vanish into history, leaving nothing but a plume of smoke and a story too daring to believe. And yet, despite the chaos, despite the fire, despite the looming death around them, Copeland's crew refused to yield. They had survived against every expectation, rewriting the rules of naval warfare with each maneuver, each torpedo, each daring strike. The Roberts was no longer just a ship. It was a statement, a testament, a defiance against the odds. The sea had turned into a labyrinth of smoke, fire, and steel. Every horizon hid another Japanese vessel. Every wave threatened to swallow the Samuel B. Roberts whole. The men were exhausted, but fatigue was a luxury they could not afford. Each second stretched like hours, and every decision could be the difference between life and obliteration. Copeland stood on the bridge, eyes scanning, senses sharpened to an almost painful clarity. Enemy destroyer, starboard side, A lookout shouted. The ship lurched as the Roberts veered sharply, the small vessel skimming across the waves like a hunted animal. The enemy fired, shells tearing the air around them, splashing water against the hull. Each strike that missed brought relief, but it was fleeting. Copeland knew they could not escape the fire forever. They had to strike back, and fast. "Prepare torpedoes. Fire when ready," he commanded. The men moved with mechanical precision, their fear transformed into focus. The torpedoes left the tubes with deadly grace, cutting through the water toward the enemy. The explosion followed, a fireball erupting across the Japanese destroyer's deck. Another kill. Smoke and debris clouded the horizon, but the Roberts had no time to celebrate. Every victory drew more attention, more vengeance. The ship groaned under the stress, hull creaking as shells impacted dangerously close. Men below decks worked frantically, patching leaks, shoring up damage, keeping the engines running. One misstep could flood compartments, sink the ship, end the crew's fight in an instant. Above, Copeland barked orders, his voice steady despite the chaos, guiding his men like a conductor orchestrating a symphony of survival. Suddenly, the Roberts entered a narrow channel, surrounded by enemy cruisers and destroyers. The odds were staggering. The enemy's guns trained on them with terrifying accuracy, fire ripping the sky with smoke and flame. Copeland gritted his teeth. Retreat was impossible. The only way out was through, and every maneuver had to be flawless. Depth charges began to fall, shaking the water violently. The hull quaked as explosions rocked the sea, sending waves that threatened to capsize the small vessel. Men shouted over the roar, clutching anything solid, bracing for the inevitable. The Roberts twisted, turned, and dove through the chaos, each evasive action calculated to the millisecond. Below decks, sailors prayed silently, gripping machinery, hoping calculations and courage were enough. Above, Copeland directed the ship like a master chess player, anticipating the enemy's every move, exploiting the smallest errors. The destroyer had become more than a ship. It was a blade, slicing through impossible odds with audacity and precision. Another torpedo, another enemy ship sent to the depths. The crew cheered briefly, but it was measured, knowing the battle was far from over. They had survived, again, against every expectation, but the sea was unforgiving and the enemy relentless. Every hit they scored was a statement, every evasion a miracle. And still, the Samuel B. Roberts pressed on, defying the might of an entire fleet, rewriting the rules of naval warfare with every daring move. The morning light barely pierced the smoke and haze over Leyte Gulf, but the Samuel B. Roberts had no time to admire the sunrise. The battle had intensified, and the sea was a living, breathing enemy. Every wave seemed to hide shells. Every shadow could conceal a torpedo. The ship shuddered under another near miss, water spraying across the deck, salt stinging eyes and skin. Yet the crew remained resolute. Fear had been transformed into a razor-sharp focus. Copeland stood on the bridge, gripping the railing, knuckles white. "All stations, report." His voice cut through the chaos like a knife. The gun crews responded with rapid precision, tracking targets across the horizon. The enemy was relentless. Cruisers, destroyers, and even battleships kept firing, trying to crush the tiny destroyer before it could inflict further damage. Yet the Roberts moved with a speed and agility no larger ship could match, ducking, weaving, striking with deadly accuracy. Below decks, sailors scrambled to keep the engines running. Leaks had become frequent, the hull creaking and groaning as shells struck perilously close. Some compartments flooded, forcing men to bail water with buckets, their muscles screaming, their lungs burning. But discipline held. Every man knew his task, knew the stakes, knew that hesitation meant death. A lookout's shout broke the tension. "Torpedo port side." The ship lurched violently as the torpedo sliced past, narrowly missing the hull. Copeland reacted instantly, ordering evasive maneuvers that pushed the Roberts to its limits. The deck tilted sharply, men bracing themselves, some thrown off balance, but never off task. Every movement had to be flawless, or the sea would claim them. Another torpedo launched from the Roberts found its target, detonating against an enemy destroyer with a blast that lit the horizon. Smoke, fire, and debris filled the air. The small crew barely had a moment to savor the kill before new threats emerged. The Japanese fleet was immense, coordinated, and merciless. Every ship seemed to move in tandem, an unbreakable wall of firepower. Yet the Roberts had become a phantom, dodging and striking with a deadly rhythm. Copeland's mind raced. He calculated every shot, every turn, every engine push. Victory was impossible by logic, but survival demanded audacity. Another torpedo, another kill, then another evasive turn to dodge incoming shellfire. The ship's hull shuddered with each impact, but the crew pressed on, driven by determination and sheer instinct. Hours dragged like days. The Roberts had become a symbol of defiance. Each strike, each maneuver, was a message. A single destroyer could still challenge the might of an empire. And though exhaustion weighed on every sailor, they refused to falter. They were alive, and they were fighting, rewriting naval history with courage and precision that no textbook had ever taught. WWII midday. The Samuel B. Roberts had become a legend in its own right. The Japanese center force, massive and imposing, continued its relentless advance, but the little destroyer had struck again and again, sinking enemy vessels with precision torpedoes and gunfire that seemed almost impossible from such a small ship. The sea around them was a battlefield strewn with wreckage, oil slicks shimmering under the harsh tropical sun, smoke rising like dark columns into the sky. Sailors on other American ships watched in awe, some unable to believe that one destroyer could inflict such havoc on an armada. On the Roberts Bridge, Commander Copeland remained a picture of calm determination. Every decision, every order, had to be instant. One misstep could mean the annihilation of the entire crew. The radar officer pointed frantically at multiple contacts converging from the northeast. Incoming destroyers and cruisers, bearing 045. Copeland nodded sharply. Prepare torpedoes. Guns ready. We hit first, or we sink trying. The crew moved like a single organism, trained to respond before commands were even fully issued. Below decks, the engineers fought a different battle. Fires had broken out in two compartments. Smoke filled the corridors, acrid and suffocating. Men worked in near darkness, patches of sparks flying from damaged electrical systems. The pumps groaned under the strain of incoming water, but determination and skill kept them going. Each second mattered. One failure could flood the engine room, leaving the Roberts helpless against the oncoming storm of enemy firepower. Above, Japanese cruisers unleashed broadsides, the shellfire tearing through the water around the Roberts, sending geysers of seawater and metal fragments across the deck. Crewmen dove and scrambled, some cut and bleeding, but they continued their tasks, reloading guns, aiming torpedoes, signaling maneuvers. Fear was constant, but it had been honed into focus. Every man understood the stakes. Every man understood that bravery was the only currency that could keep them alive. The destroyer executed a daring maneuver, turning sharply into the path of enemy fire to draw attention away from a nearby American convoy. The gamble was audacious. Shells tore the air where the Roberts had been moments before, splintering wood and metal, sending shrapnel flying. The crew barely had a moment to register the explosion before they returned fire, torpedoes launching with deadly accuracy. Another enemy destroyer erupted in flames, its crew scrambling, its fate sealed. By late afternoon, the Roberts had inflicted 5 confirmed kills. Smoke and fire surrounded the fleet. Chaos reigned, yet the tiny ship pressed on. Every torpedo launched, every shell fired, was a testament to audacity. Unyielding willpower. Copeland's voice, calm but commanding, guided his men through the inferno. But exhaustion was a silent enemy. Muscle screamed, vision blurred, adrenaline thinned. One misstep now could cost everything. The Roberts had become both hunter and hunted, a symbol of defiance against an overwhelming force. The Japanese fleet, though battered, was relentless, and the sun was beginning to set over a sea painted with fire and smoke. The next hours would test the destroyer and its crew like never before. Night fell like a curtain over the Leyte Gulf, swallowing the smoke and flames of the battered Japanese fleet. The sea was a dark expanse, broken only by the occasional fire from wrecked ships and the streaks of tracer rounds cutting through the night sky. On the bridge of the USS Samuel B. Roberts, the crew moved with a tense precision that bordered on instinct. Every shadow could hide an enemy torpedo. Every ripple in the water could signal impending doom. Commander Copeland knew the destroyer's limits. The Roberts was not built to withstand battleship fire. Its armor was minimal, its guns smaller, its survival dependent entirely on speed, maneuverability, and the courage of men who refused to flinch. Yet here they were, alone in the heart of the center force, having already sunk 5 enemy vessels. The night air was thick with anticipation and fear. Below deck, the engineering crew fought to keep the ship's systems operational. Water leaked into compartments faster than the pumps could manage. Sparks from damaged circuits illuminated the darkness, casting fleeting, ghostly shadows on men whose faces were smudged with grime and sweat. They labored silently, eyes fixed on gauges and valves, hands trembling with exhaustion, yet every movement was precise. They knew any lapse could doom the entire ship. Suddenly, a warning came from the sonar station. Incoming torpedo, starboard side. The cry ripped through the decks. Copeland's calm, measured voice cut through the tension. Hard right. Brace for impact. The destroyer heeled sharply, water cascading over the deck as the torpedo passed mere feet from the hull. The crew held their positions, hearts pounding in a rhythm that matched the ship's deadly dance with death. Moments later, the Roberts returned fire. Torpedoes streaked through the water, striking another Japanese destroyer, which erupted in a towering column of fire. Explosions echoed across the Gulf, a grim symphony of destruction. Every kill came at a cost. Every maneuver, every shot, brought the Roberts closer to its own breaking point. The night stretched on, a relentless trial of nerves and skill. Crewmen moved with mechanical precision, their bodies screaming for rest, but their focus unbroken. Above them, the sky was a black canvas, lit intermittently by tracer fire and burning ships. The Japanese fleet, though suffering heavy losses, pressed the attack. Shells slammed into the water around the Roberts, some splashing mere feet from the deck, others striking with deadly accuracy. Copeland's commands were steady, unwavering, a lifeline in the chaos. Steady, steady, fire when ready, adjust course now. Each order was executed with flawless timing. The destroyer danced between destruction and survival, a tiny vessel carrying the weight of impossibility on its shoulders. By dawn, the Samuel B. Roberts had survived the night, but the toll was evident. Hull pocked with damage, fires smoldering, and crew exhausted beyond measure. Yet the ship's spirit, like that of its men, remained unbroken. The legend of the destroyer killer would be written in the blood and courage of every sailor aboard, a testament to audacity in the face of overwhelming force. The final battle loomed on the horizon, the Roberts poised for its last, desperate stand. The morning sun barely pierced the smoke-hazed horizon, illuminating a sea littered with wreckage and fire. The USS Samuel B. Roberts limped forward, its battered hull groaning with every wave, each impact a reminder of the battles fought and lives nearly lost. The destroyer's silhouette, tiny against the massive Japanese fleet, carried an impossible weight. 5 enemy ships sunk, countless shells dodged, and a crew teetering on the brink of exhaustion. Commander Copeland stood on the bridge, eyes scanning the waters. The center force, though weakened, had not surrendered. Battleships and cruisers loomed like giants, their guns trained with lethal precision. Every decision Copeland made now could mean life or death for the men he commanded, for the destroyer itself, a fragile instrument in a symphony of chaos. Below deck, sailors braced against flooding compartments, water rising around the engines. Pumps worked overtime, but the Roberts was not invincible. Every hit had taken its toll. Electrical fires, smashed bulkheads, splintered decks. Yet even in the face of relentless assault, every man moved with unwavering focus. Hands slick with oil and sweat manipulated valves, repaired rigging, and prepared the remaining guns. They were fighting not just for survival, but for a story that would echo far beyond the Leyte Gulf. Then, as if the sea itself recognized the audacity, a lull came. Enemy formations hesitated, momentarily stunned by the tiny destroyer's audacity. Copeland seized the moment. Orders were shouted, torpedoes readied, guns aimed. Every strike was precise, calculated, and deadly. Another enemy ship erupted in flames, sending a plume of black smoke into the sky. The Roberts' reputation as the destroyer killer spread across the fleet. Whispers of courage and impossible feats traveled faster than radio waves. But the cost was visible in every eye, every wound. Crewmen clung to each other and the railings, faces streaked with grime, exhaustion, and fear. The destroyer shuddered under bombardment, metal screaming as shells struck. Copeland remained resolute, the embodiment of calculated defiance, his mind running every maneuver, every contingency, every chance of survival. Finally, amid the chaos, the inevitable struck. A direct hit tore through the hull, explosions ripping the ship apart. Water poured in. Smoke choked the decks. The crew abandoned ship, plunging into the Gulf, their bodies battered, their spirits burning with the memory of what they had accomplished. Yet even as the Roberts sank beneath the waves, her story did not die. For the men who survived, the legend became living memory. They carried with them the knowledge that one small ship, guided by courage and strategy, had defied overwhelming odds, striking fear into a mighty fleet. Japan would never forget the day the destroyer killed 5 ships, and neither would history. Years later, when survivors recounted their ordeal, they did not speak of despair. They spoke of audacity, of the unbreakable bond between sailors, of the tiny destroyer that challenged the rules of naval warfare. The USS Samuel B. Roberts did not just fight. She inspired, proving that courage, determination, and skill could change the tide of war, one impossible strike at a time. Even in defeat, her legend endured, etched into the annals of naval history, a reminder that heroes sometimes sail in the smallest of vessels, and that bravery knows no size.